One thing we've been talking about on this channel over the past couple weeks has been how the mainstream media has been ignoring Tara Reade and her allegations against Joe Biden. And some sources have started to cover the story, but on the whole, it's basically been suppressed by some of the biggest news sources in the United States. Finally, the New York Times has weighed in, and you might expect the New York Times to do a good job, but what they produced was actually quite shameful, and I found the coverage, to be honest, horrendous. It was full of this idea that Tara Reade's allegations could not be corroborated and that Tara Reade's allegations fit no existing pattern from Joe Biden. And the whole piece is troubling from my perspective, but there's one particular paragraph and there was one particular tweet the New York Times put out, which they've tried to delete, but even as they've done that, it really showcases just how far they're willing to bend backwards and defend Joe Biden even when there's no reasonable position upon which to defend him here. No other allegation about sexual assault surfaced in the course of our reporting, nor did any former Biden staff corroborate Reade's allegation. We found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Biden beyond hugs, kisses, and touching that women previously said made them feel uncomfortable. That is such an awful paragraph for at least two key reasons. First and foremost, the highlighted passage there basically does establish a pattern. You might not think those things are as serious as what Tara Reade is alleging, and you'd probably be right, but to suggest that unwanted touching is fully disconnected from Tara Reade and her allegations is just false. These are part of a broad pattern. The idea that you would touch somebody without their consent in one way and then in another way, I don't think is that unreasonable. I think it's perfectly reasonable to suggest that these things are more connected than what the New York Times is giving credit for. There are numerous clips on the internet of Joe Biden clearly making women and girls, teenagers, and younger girls very uncomfortable by how he invades their personal space. This is not a one-off thing. To suggest that there is no pattern is a lie. 100%. And you might say, isn't lie a strong word? Well, maybe, but why did the New York Times delete that tweet and delete the relevant passage? Because they knew that that looked awful and they knew that there is a pattern. But even the first part of that paragraph is actually quite troubling because, again, it seems to suggest that nothing that Tara Reade has said has ever been corroborated with regard to the allegations. But as Nathan J. Robinson from Current Affairs noted on Twitter earlier this morning, there are corroborations. Even if you talk to former people within the Biden staff community, when Tara Reade brought these allegations up, she was effectively demoted, and people have corroborated that. One of the things Tara Reade noted is that after she tried to bring this story to light in the 1990s, when she was working for Joe Biden, she was in charge of interns, and after bringing it up, she was no longer in charge of interns, which was in effect a sort of demotion for daring to speak ill of the great Joe Biden. Everyone notes that. They might not all agree that this was the reason, but that is a corroboration of at least a major part of Tara Reade's story, and that paragraph fails to capture that reality. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's been 100% fully corroborated, but there is corroboration, and I think perfectly relevant corroboration. This is just such a poor attempt on behalf of giving Tara Reade journalistic justice, and frankly, it's a poor attempt to reflect how media needs to cover these stories. This is an abject failure, and I don't quite get what the New York Times is trying to do. Are they trying to defend Joe Biden? Maybe they're still afraid, and I thought this was the reason before Bernie suspended his campaign, but maybe these sources are still afraid that this story could take Joe Biden down and make Bernie Sanders the nominee. And if there's one thing we know about the biggest sources of mainstream media in the United States, is that they're all united in their fear and hatred of Bernie Sanders and his Democratic Socialist agenda. And anything to keep the one man in the spot that's the barrier between Bernie and the Democratic nomination, aka Joe Biden, is somebody they're going to defend. I didn't think they would continue to do it after the nomination was deemed over by most people, but here we are. And it's also very telling when this story dropped. You know, this isn't necessarily the be-all end-all of stories, but the tweet that I'm quoting to you in this video was put out at about 2:33 in the morning on Easter Sunday. That's a very, very odd time to put out such a very important story. And you might say, well, maybe a lot of people will be reading the news sources on a Sunday afternoon. A lot of people aren't working, and when we're in this crisis, a lot of people are home. But in general, you don't release big stories like this, big investigative pieces, you know, with a view of minimizing the mainstream 9 to 5, Monday to Friday media audience that often exists. Sort of like how when you want to bury a story, you put it out on Friday afternoon. Well, maybe you wanted to bury a story by putting it out overnight on Easter weekend. This story isn't going away, however. It's not going away because Joe Biden has so many related patterns. This isn't a one-off. The New York Times can lie to people all they want, but there is more than one instance in this broad story. Not all of them are identical to Tara Reade's allegations, but they are in a similar ballpark, in my opinion. And the story isn't just going to disappear. Again, if anything, I do believe that this story will continue to get more and more and more coverage as it becomes more and more likely that Biden will clinch the nomination, and therefore the neoliberal media does not have to worry about Bernie Sanders, and they can start to report on this story. Because if we're being cynical, some of those sources support Donald Trump and want him to win, and all of them want the high ratings that a story like this will bring to their websites and to their TV networks. You know, sacrificing all that to get rid of Bernie Sanders was something they'd be willing to do, but I don't know if they'd be willing to ignore this blockbuster story until November. And this is what us Bernie Sanders supporters were trying to say, that whether it was on policy, cognitive decline, dementia, or Biden's personal scandals, this is not a man that's going to make it to November in a strong position to win the election, to defeat Donald Trump. Decisions have to be made now and quickly about whether this man can represent a party that supposedly cares about women's equality, women's basic human rights, and women's dignity. I don't think it can stand with Joe Biden and stand with those values.